CEO shocked to see ex-wife with twins after betrayal, unaware they are his own children, but what happens at the end surprises everyone. My beautiful family, welcome back to Mr. Peter's Stories and Merry Christmas to everyone. I've been putting in 16-hour days to bring you the best content, but the response to the last two videos has been lower than expected, and honestly, it breaks my heart. I truly believe in this journey, and I need your support more than ever. If you're happy with my efforts and enjoy my content, please drop a yes in the comments. It would mean the world to me and motivate me to work even harder. Together, we can make this channel something amazing. Thank you for being my family. Let's make it happen. The dawn painted Seattle's skyline in shades of amber and rose, its first rays catching the mirrored surface of Sterling Provisions headquarters. Alexander Sterling stood at his penthouse window, watching the city wake beneath him. At 35, he'd built an empire that dominated the Pacific Northwest's retail landscape, yet the victory felt hollow in the pre-dawn silence of his empty home. His reflection stared back at him from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Tall frame, impeccably dressed in a hand-tailored Tom Ford suit, dark hair touched with distinguished silver at the temples, and eyes the color of winter seas. Those eyes, inherited from a mother he barely remembered, had grown harder with each passing year, each betrayal, each lesson in the cost of trust. The morning paper lay on his custom-built walnut desk, today's headlines, just variations on familiar themes. Sterling Provisions, empire built on ruthless tactics, retail titans' controversial expansion plans, Seattle's most eligible bachelor, the man behind the millions. Alexander's lips curved into a mirthless smile as he scanned the articles. The press had created their narrative, the cold-hearted business titan, the man who trusted spreadsheets more than people. They weren't entirely wrong. Trust had become a luxury he could no longer afford, not after watching his father's business partners strip their family company bare when he was 16, not after countless betrayals had taught him that vulnerability was merely an invitation to pain. He moved through his morning routine with military precision, each action calculated and purposeful. The gym in his private suite, equipped with state-of-the-art machinery, witnessed his daily battle against personal demons. Every rep, every mile on the treadmill was a reminder that control was everything. Control was safety. Control was power. The memory of his father's final days still haunted him. John Sterling, once proud and strong, reduced to a shell of himself after the betrayal. "Trust no one in business, son," he'd whispered from his hospital bed. "They'll smile while they stab you in the back." Those words had become Alexander's mantra, the foundation upon which he'd rebuilt the Sterling name. His phone buzzed. Marcus Chen, his CFO, confirming the quarterly performance review. Alexander texted back his acknowledgement, already mentally preparing for the parade of presentations and reports that awaited him. These meetings were usually exercises in tedium, but they were necessary. Everything in his world was necessary, calculated, precise. The drive to Sterling Provisions headquarters was a lesson in Seattle's morning chaos. His Mercedes navigated through traffic as his mind wandered to the expansion plans for their new organic food division. The project was ambitious, a complete reimagining of luxury grocery shopping for the modern consumer. His competitors were scrambling to catch up, but Alexander had always been 3 steps ahead. Ray Lin, his executive assistant for the past 5 years, met him at the elevator with his usual morning coffee. Black, no sugar, and a stack of reports. "Board members are already arriving, Mr. Sterling," she informed him, falling into step beside him. "And the quarterly numbers just came in from our Portland locations. We're up 12% from last quarter." He nodded, taking the coffee. "The new inventory management system is paying off. Make sure Marcus has those numbers for his presentation." The words came automatically, part of the carefully choreographed dance of corporate leadership. The boardroom buzzed with nervous energy as he entered. Department heads shuffled papers, adjusted laptops, rehearsed presentations under their breath. Alexander took his seat at the head of the gleaming mahogany table, nodding to Marcus to begin the proceedings. The first hour passed in a blur of profit margins and market penetration data. Alexander's mind was already racing ahead to the afternoon's meetings when a voice cut through his thoughts like a warm knife through butter. Our customer engagement metrics show a significant shift in shopping patterns among millennials and Gen Z. He looked up, and for the first time in years, Alexander Sterling felt the world tilt on its axis. The woman standing before the board radiated quiet confidence, her presentation style elegant yet unpretentious. Sophie Cambridge, according to the nameplate before her seat. Her auburn hair caught the morning light streaming through the windows, creating a halo effect that seemed almost ethereal, but it was her eyes that captured him, intelligent, determined, with a hint of defiance that suggested she hadn't been handed anything in life. She moved through her market analysis with precision, breaking down complex data into compelling narratives. Her innovative suggestions for combining traditional luxury retail with sustainable practices and community engagement struck a chord he hadn't known existed. Here was someone who saw beyond profit margins to the heart of what Sterling Provisions could become. Alexander found himself studying her as she spoke. The way she gestured to emphasize key points, the subtle confidence in her stance, the passion that colored her voice when discussing community impact initiatives. She wasn't just presenting data, she was painting a vision of what his company could be. Ms. Cambridge's analysis raises several interesting points, Marcus commented as she concluded. Though some might consider the community investment proposals ambitious for our current quarter. Sophie met Marcus's skepticism with a measured smile. With respect, Mr. Chen, I believe ambitious is exactly what Sterling Provisions needs to be. Our competitors are scrambling to adapt to changing consumer values. We have the opportunity to lead rather than follow. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Alexander. He stood slowly, moving to the window as if contemplating the city below. In reality, he needed a moment to compose himself, to understand why this woman's presence had thrown him so completely off balance. "Tell me, Miss Cambridge," he said finally, turning back to face her, "what made you choose Sterling Provisions? Your resume suggests you had other options." Sophie met his gaze directly, and he felt that same jolt of electricity he'd experienced earlier. "I chose Sterling Provisions because I saw potential beyond profit margins. This company has the resources and reach to redefine what luxury retail means in the modern age. It's not just about premium products anymore. It's about creating an experience that aligns with consumers' values." Her words echoed his own private thoughts, dreams he'd barely acknowledged even to himself. For years, he'd focused on building an impenetrable fortress of success, but somewhere along the way, he'd lost sight of the vision that had first driven him. The meeting concluded, board members filing out with their usual mix of relief and anxiety. Alexander found himself watching Sophie gather her materials, her movements graceful and purposeful. Before he could second-guess himself, he called out, "Ms. Cambridge, a moment of your time?" She turned, portfolio clutched to her chest, professional mask firmly in place. "Yes, Mr. Sterling?" He approached her, conscious of the curious glances from the last departing board members. "Your presentation was illuminating. I'd like to discuss your ideas further." He paused, then added, "Over dinner, perhaps?" A slight smile played at her lips, transforming her features from merely beautiful to breathtaking. "Is this a business dinner, Mr. Sterling?" His heart raced traitorously, but his voice remained steady. "That depends entirely on how the conversation flows." Sophie studied him for a moment, and he had the disconcerting feeling she was seeing past his carefully constructed facades to something he thought he'd buried long ago. "I'd like that," she said finally. As she walked away, Alexander remained rooted to the spot, his mind already racing ahead. For the first time in years, he felt something dangerous stirring in his chest, hope perhaps, or something even more terrifying. Back in his office, he found himself unable to focus on the afternoon's tasks. The city sprawled beneath his window, but his thoughts kept returning to Sophie's presentation, to the way she'd challenged conventional thinking, to the spark of something genuine in her eyes. He called Raylin. "I need a dinner reservation for 2 tonight. Canlis. Make sure they give us the private room overlooking the lake." "Of course, Mr. Sterling. Will this be a business dinner?" He paused, considering the question. "No," he said finally. "This is personal." The word felt foreign on his tongue. Personal. When was the last time he'd done anything truly personal? His life had become a series of strategic moves, each step calculated to build and protect his empire. But something about Sophie Cambridge made him want to step off the carefully constructed path he'd built for himself. Later that evening, as Seattle's lights began to twinkle against the darkening sky, Alexander found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, standing before his closet, actually caring about what to wear. He laughed at his own reflection, a sound foreign even to his own ears. The navy blazer he finally selected was casual enough to suggest this wasn't strictly business, yet elegant enough to maintain his usual standards. As he adjusted his cuffs, his eyes fell on a photo tucked away in the corner of his dresser mirror, him and his father at the original Sterling grocery store, both smiling before everything fell apart. "What would you think of me now, Dad?" he whispered to the image. "Still playing it safe? Still keeping everyone at arm's length?" His phone buzzed. The car was waiting downstairs. Alexander took one last look in the mirror, seeing not just the successful businessman, but also the shadows of the young man who'd once dreamed of building something meaningful, something that would last. As he stepped into the elevator, his heart rate picked up slightly. For the first time in years, Alexander Sterling was doing something unplanned, something that wasn't part of a careful strategy. He was following an impulse that had nothing to do with business, and everything to do with the way Sophie Cambridge's smile had made him feel alive again. The city lights blurred past his car window as his driver navigated through evening traffic. Seattle was beautiful at night, all gleaming towers and reflected lights, but tonight it seemed different somehow, full of possibility, as if Sophie's presence had shifted something fundamental in his world. What he couldn't know, as his car pulled up to Canlis's elegant entrance, was that this dinner would be the first chapter of a story that would reshape his entire world, a story of love, betrayal, redemption, and the kind of truth that only comes after losing everything you thought you needed to keep. He checked his watch, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the evening air. Above him, stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a ferry's horn echoed across Elliott Bay. It was time to begin. Chapter 2. Hearts Unveiled. The private dining room at Canlis floated above Lake Union like a crystal box in the sky, Seattle's lights dancing on the water below. Alexander arrived 15 minutes early, a lifetime habit that had served him well in business. Tonight, though, it felt less like strategy and more like eagerness. "Mr. Sterling," the maître d' greeted him with practiced deference. "Your usual table is ready. Shall I have Thomas bring your preferred whiskey while you wait?" Alexander nodded, his fingers drumming an unconscious rhythm on the polished mahogany bar. The whiskey arrived, Macallan 25 neat, but he barely tasted it. His mind kept returning to the boardroom, to the way Sophie's presence had cut through years of carefully constructed walls. Raylin, his executive assistant, had already compiled a detailed brief on Sophie Cambridge. It sat unopened in his phone's email, and for once, Alexander resisted the urge to prepare, to know everything in advance. Tonight, he wanted to discover Sophie the old-fashioned way, through conversation, through the natural unfolding of two people getting to know each other. At precisely 7 o'clock, Sophie appeared in the restaurant's entrance. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. She'd changed from her business attire into a deep burgundy dress that caught the evening light like liquid garnets. Her auburn hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders, and a simple pearl pendant drew attention to the elegant line of her neck. "You look stunning," he said as she approached, the words coming unbidden to his lips. A slight blush colored her cheeks. "Thank you. I wasn't sure about the dress. It's not exactly board meeting attire." "It's perfect," he assured her, pulling out her chair. As she sat, the scent of her perfume, something subtle and floral, teased his senses. The sommelier approached with a wine list, but Alexander waved him away. "Sophie, do you trust me with the wine selection?" She smiled, that same knowing look from earlier dancing in her eyes. Does the great Alexander Sterling actually want someone to trust him? The question caught him off guard, its playful surface masking a deeper insight that made him pause. "I suppose I do," he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. He selected a bottle of Chateau Margaux 2005, and as the sommelier departed, an unexpected silence fell between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, rather, it felt like the pause before a symphony begins, full of anticipation and possibility. "Tell me something," Sophie said finally, breaking the silence. "Something that isn't in the press, releases and annual reports. Something real." Alexander studied her face in the candlelight, searching for any hint of the calculation he was so used to seeing in others. He found none. "I hate caviar," he said suddenly. Sophie blinked, then laughed, a genuine, melodious sound that seemed to fill the room with warmth. "The man who owns Seattle's most exclusive gourmet markets hates caviar. Can't stand it. But it's expected, isn't it? The successful businessman with refined tastes?" He shrugged, a surprisingly casual gesture for a man usually so controlled. "I'd rather have a burger from Dick's Drive-In any day." "Now that's interesting." Sophie leaned forward, her eyes sparkling. "Any other surprising confessions?" The wine arrived, and as the sommelier went through the ritual of presentation and tasting, Alexander found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. When they were alone again, he continued, "I play the piano. Not well, but it helps me think, and I have a secret addiction to old black and white movies." "Casablanca?" Sophie asked, taking a sip of her wine. "The Maltese Falcon, actually. There's something about film noir, the shadows, the complexity, the way nothing is quite what it seems." "Like you?" The question was gentle, but it carried weight. Alexander met her gaze over the rim of his wine glass. "Most people don't challenge me so directly, Miss Cambridge. Most people are probably too intimidated by the Alexander Sterling myth to see the man behind it." She paused, then added softly, "And I think we're well past Ms. Cambridge, don't you?" The conversation flowed as naturally as the wine, moving from movies to music, from childhood dreams to adult realities. Sophie told him about growing up in a small town outside Portland, about the grandfather who taught her to play chess and think 3 moves ahead, about the scholarship that had brought her to Seattle for college. "It wasn't easy," she admitted, pushing her dessert plate aside. "Working full-time while studying, trying to prove I belonged in spaces where everyone else seemed to have it all figured out. But you did belong," Alexander said, recognizing in her story echoes of his own struggles. "You more than belonged, you excelled." Is that what you see in me, Alexander? Excellence. The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. I see someone who understands what it means to build something from nothing, someone who doesn't take shortcuts or make excuses, someone who... He hesitated, then finished softly. Someone who makes me want to lower my guard. Sophie reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand. The touch was electric, sending sparks of awareness through his entire body. And does that frighten you? Terrify is more accurate, he admitted, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I'm not good at this, Sophie, at being vulnerable. Who said anything about vulnerability? Her smile held a hint of mischief. Maybe I just want to know if the great Alexander Sterling can dance. He raised an eyebrow. Here? Why not? You own the place, don't you? Actually, I don't. Canlis is one of the few Seattle institutions I haven't acquired. Even better. Sophie stood, extending her hand. There were just two people, in a beautiful room with an excellent wine buzz and a story waiting to be written. The restaurant's house pianist had been playing softly in the background all evening, and as if on cue, the opening notes of "The Way You Look Tonight" floated through the air. Alexander hesitated for just a moment before taking her hand and leading her to a small open space near the windows. As they swayed together, Seattle's lights twinkling below them like earthbound stars, Alexander felt something shift inside him. The walls he'd built so carefully began to crack, letting in a warmth he'd forgotten existed. "You're full of surprises," Sophie murmured against his chest. "You dance beautifully. My mother insisted on lessons. She said every gentleman should know how to waltz. Tell me about her." The request was gentle, but Alexander felt his chest tighten. "She died when I was young. Cancer. I remember her laugh more than anything else. It could fill a room, make everyone around her feel special." Sophie lifted her head to look at him, her eyes soft with understanding. "Is that why you stopped letting yourself laugh, afraid it wouldn't measure up?" The insight struck him like a physical blow. No one had ever made that connection before, perhaps because no one had ever gotten close enough to see it. "You see too much," he whispered. "Or maybe just enough," she countered, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. "Sometimes the strongest walls are built around the softest hearts." The kiss, when it came, was inevitable as gravity. Alexander cupped her face in his hands, marveling at the softness of her skin, the way she seemed to fit perfectly against him. It wasn't a kiss of passion or desperation, but something deeper. A recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits finding each other against impossible odds. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Sophie smiled, still terrified. "More than ever," he admitted. "But for the first time in my life, I think I'm okay with that." The evening ended too soon, though they'd closed down the restaurant. As Alexander's driver navigated through Seattle's empty streets, Sophie's head rested comfortably on his shoulder, their fingers intertwined. "Let me take you to brunch tomorrow," he said softly. "I know a place with a view that makes Canlis look ordinary." Tempting. But I have plans tomorrow morning. Volunteer work at the children's hospital." She lifted her head to look at him. "You could join me instead. See firsthand what I was talking about in my presentation. Community engagement that goes beyond tax write-offs." Alexander felt his usual reflexive denial rising. Sundays were for reviewing reports, preparing for the week ahead. But something in Sophie's expression made him pause. "What time?" Her smile was worth every second of missed work he'd have to make up later. The car pulled up to her building, a modest apartment complex in Queen Anne, nothing like the luxury high-rises where most of his social circle lived. Before she could reach for the door handle, Alexander was out and around the car, opening her door with old-world courtesy. "Thank you for tonight," Sophie said, her hand lingering in his. for letting me see past the empire to the emperor. Thank you for looking, he replied softly. Another kiss, this one promising more to come, and then she was gone, disappearing into her building with a final wave. Alexander stood watching until he saw a light go on in what he assumed was her apartment, then got back in the car. Home, sir? His driver asked. Alexander looked at his reflection in the car's window, barely recognizing the man who smiled back at him. Yes, home. But as the car pulled away from the curb, he realized that for the first time in years, his penthouse apartment didn't feel like home anymore. Home, he was beginning to understand, might have more to do with the way Sophie's eyes lit up when she laughed, the way her hand felt in his, the way she saw through his carefully constructed facades to the man he'd almost forgotten he could be. His phone buzzed. A text from Sophie. Made it up safely. Though I'm not sure I'll be able to sleep. You've given me a lot to think about, Mr. Sterling. Alexander smiled, typing back, Likewise, Ms. Cambridge. Dream well. As Seattle's night wrapped around him like a familiar blanket, Alexander Sterling, the man who had built an empire on control and calculation, found himself looking forward to something he couldn't predict or manage. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, and for once he was content to let the story unfold on its own. In his pocket, he still had the business card Sophie had slipped him with the children's hospital's address. He pulled it out, running his fingers over the embossed letters. Sunday morning wouldn't find him in his usual spot behind his desk, surrounded by reports and projections. Instead, he'd be stepping into Sophie's world, seeing life through her eyes. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a quiet anticipation he hadn't felt since he was young, when the world still held the promise of undiscovered wonders. His last thought before sleep claimed him was of Sophie's laugh, and how it filled empty spaces he hadn't even known existed in his carefully ordered world. Chapter 3. Love's Awakening. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear, Seattle's usual cloud cover giving way to unexpected sunshine. Alexander stood before the children's hospital, feeling oddly out of place in his casual attire. Dark jeans and a cashmere sweater instead of his usual suit armor. The building's cheerful exterior, decorated with painted butterflies and rainbows, seemed a world away from his sterile corporate environment. Sophie was waiting in the lobby, her face lighting up when she saw him. She wore simple black leggings and a soft blue sweater, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail, yet Alexander thought she'd never looked more beautiful. You came, she said, genuine pleasure in her voice. Did you think I wouldn't? The Alexander Sterling I met in the boardroom? No, he wouldn't have. But you... She reached up to straighten his slightly askew collar. You're full of surprises. The morning passed in a blur of activity. Alexander found himself reading stories to children in the oncology ward, his usual commanding voice softening as he gave different characters unique voices. Sophie watched from the doorway, her heart melting at the sight of Seattle's most formidable businessman, making a room full of sick children laugh with his impression of a grumpy bear. During a quiet moment, while the children were having their lunch, Sophie found him staring out a window, lost in thought. Penny for your thoughts? She asked, sliding her hand into his. I've been thinking about what you said in your presentation, about community engagement being more than tax write-offs. He turned to face her, his eyes intense. These kids, they deserve more than just charitable donations. They deserve hope, laughter, a chance to just be children despite everything they're facing. Sophie's heart skipped a beat at the passion in his voice. What are you thinking? I'm thinking Sterling Provisions needs a foundation, not just for show, but something real, something that makes a difference. He squeezed her hand. Would you help me build it? That moment marked the beginning of a transformation, not just in their relationship, but in Alexander himself. Over the next 3 months, they fell into a rhythm that felt both exciting and comfortable. Weekday mornings found them in board meetings, maintaining professional distance while stealing glances across the conference table. But evenings and weekends belonged to them alone. They explored Seattle's hidden gems together. Tiny bookstores tucked away in forgotten corners, hole-in-the-wall restaurants with food that put five-star establishments to shame, secret gardens perched on rooftops above the city's chaos. Alexander found himself rediscovering his own city through Sophie's eyes, seeing beauty in places he'd overlooked for years. One rainy evening, as they huddled under an awning after running from their cab to her apartment building, Sophie looked up at him, raindrops clinging to her eyelashes. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she said simply. Alexander felt his heart stop, then restart with a rhythm that seemed to echo her words. Instead of the panic he'd expected to feel at such a declaration, he felt peace. "I think I fell for you the moment you challenged Marcus in that first meeting." Their laughter mingled with the sound of rain, and their kiss tasted of Seattle's storms and newfound hope. The Sterling Provisions Children's Foundation launched with unprecedented success. Sophie's vision combined with Alexander's resources created something extraordinary. A program that didn't just provide medical support but brought joy and normalcy to sick children and their families. The press dubbed it a corporate responsibility revolution, but Alexander and Sophie knew it was simply love made manifest in the world. On a crisp autumn evening, exactly 6 months after their first dinner at Canlis, Alexander took Sophie back to the same private dining room. But this time, instead of business presentations and careful conversations, he had something else planned. The room was transformed. Hundreds of white roses filled every surface, their fragrance mixing with the salt air from the lake below. A string quartet played softly in the corner, and the city lights seemed to dance in celebration. "Alexander," Sophie breathed, taking in the scene. "What is all this?" He led her to the window where they'd shared their first dance, then dropped to one knee. The ring he pulled from his pocket caught the candlelight, a vintage Art Deco piece he'd spent weeks searching for, knowing Sophie would appreciate its history and uniqueness more than any modern diamond. "Sophie Cambridge," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "You walked into my life and changed everything. You showed me that true strength isn't about building walls, but having the courage to let them down. You taught me that real success isn't measured in profit margins, but in the lives we touch and the love we share." Tears glistened in Sophie's eyes as he continued. "I spent years building an empire, but it was empty until you filled it with laughter and purpose and love. You make me want to be better, not just as a businessman, but as a human being. Will you marry me?" Sophie's yes was barely a whisper, but it echoed in Alexander's heart like a symphony. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, the string quartet began playing "The Way You Look Tonight," and they danced, lost in their own world of promise and possibility. The wedding planning became a project that brought out both their strengths. Alexander wanted to give Sophie everything, but she insisted on keeping things intimate and meaningful. They finally compromised on a ceremony at Thornwood Castle, a historic manor house on American Lake, just outside Seattle. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and crisp, autumn painting the surrounding forest in shades of gold and crimson. Alexander stood in his suite, adjusting his bow tie for the 100th time, when Raylan knocked on his door. "There's someone here to see you," she said softly, stepping aside to reveal Marcus Chen. The CFO entered, carrying a small wooden box. "Your father gave this to me years ago," he explained, opening the box to reveal a pair of vintage cufflinks. "He said to give them to you on your wedding day, when you found someone who made you laugh like your mother made him laugh." Alexander's throat tightened as he took the cufflinks, his father's favorites, the ones his mother had given him on their own wedding day. "Thank you, Marcus," he managed, the simple pieces of metal suddenly feeling like a bridge between past and present, between loss and new beginnings. The ceremony itself was intimate, with only their closest friends and colleagues in attendance, but it was the vows that brought tears to every eye in the room. Sophie went first, her voice clear and strong. "Alexander, when we met, I saw beneath the empire builder to the man who needed to be reminded how to laugh. I promised to keep reminding you. I promised to challenge you when you need challenging, support you when you need supporting, and love you even when you think you don't deserve it. I promise to be your partner in all things, in business and in life, in joy and in sorrow, in success and in failure. Most of all, I promise to never let you forget that true strength lies not in standing alone, but in standing together." Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he held Sophie's. "Sophie, you came into my life like sunrise after the longest night. You showed me that the walls I built to keep pain out were also keeping love away. I promise to keep those walls down for you. I promise to be not just the man you married, but to strive every day to be the man you believe I can be. I promise to laugh with you, dream with you, and build not just business empires, but a life filled with purpose and joy. I promise to love you not in spite of your challenges to my carefully ordered world, but because of them. You are my true north, my home, my heart's revolution." The reception was a blend of elegance and warmth, just like the couple themselves. The tables were named after children's books instead of numbers, and each centerpiece included a donation in the guests' honor to the Children's Foundation. Even the cake was special, each tier representing a different chapter of their story, from the boardroom where they met to the hospital where they first volunteered together. As evening fell, strings of lights transformed the castle's gardens into an enchanted forest. Alexander held Sophie close as they swayed to their first dance as husband and wife. "Happy," he murmured against her hair. "Beyond words," she replied, then looked up at him with that spark of mischief he'd grown to love. "Though I do have one complaint." "Oh, you've yet to show me if that piano playing you mentioned on our first date is any good." Alexander laughed, leading her to the grand piano that stood in the castle's great hall. As their guests gathered around, he began to play, not a classical piece as everyone expected, but As Time Goes By from Casablanca, singing softly to his bride as his fingers danced across the keys. Later that night, as they stood on the castle's balcony, watching the last guests depart, Sophie leaned back against Alexander's chest. "Do you believe in fairy tales?" she asked. He kissed her temple, breathing in the scent of roses from her hair. "I believe in us, in what we can build together, in the story we're writing. Even though it's not perfectly controlled and predicted like your business plans?" "Especially because of that," he replied, turning her to face him. "You've taught me that the best stories are the ones that surprise us." The night wrapped around them like a velvet cloak, stars twinkling overhead like nature's wedding lights. Tomorrow they would leave for their honeymoon, 3 weeks exploring the hidden corners of Europe. But for now, they simply held each other, two souls who had found their way home against all odds. As midnight approached, a shooting star streaked across the sky. Sophie made a wish, though later she would say she already had everything she'd ever wished for. Alexander, watching her face in the starlight, silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought this extraordinary woman into his boardroom and into his heart. What neither of them could know, as they stood wrapped in love and starlight, was that their fairy tale would soon face its greatest test. But that was tomorrow's chapter. Tonight belonged to love, to promises made and kept, to the beginning of a journey that would change them both in ways they could never imagine. Chapter 4. Paradise Found and Dreams Unveiled. Venice greeted them with a symphony of church bells and lapping water, the morning sun turning the Grand Canal into a ribbon of liquid gold. Alexander helped Sophie into a sleek wooden water taxi, their fingers intertwined as the boat cut through the ancient waterways. Their honeymoon suite at the Amman Venice waited like a fairy tale come to life. Frescoed ceilings, Murano glass chandeliers, and a private terrace overlooking the timeless beauty of the floating city. "It's like stepping into a dream," Sophie whispered, running her hand along the marble balustrade of their terrace. The October air carried the scent of the sea mixed with espresso from the cafes below. Alexander wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I used to come here on business trips," he said softly. "I saw the art, the architecture, the history, but I never really saw the magic until now. You make everything new again." Their days fell into a rhythm that felt both adventurous and intimate. Mornings began with breakfast on their terrace, fresh brioche and cappuccino, surrounded by the gentle sounds of Venice awakening. They explored the city's hidden corners, deliberately getting lost in the maze-like streets until they stumbled upon tiny restaurants where elderly signoras served pasta that tasted of tradition and love. One evening, as they sat in a small baccaro drinking prosecco and sampling cicchetti, Sophie noticed Alexander checking his phone for the 5th time in an hour. "The company won't collapse without you," she teased gently, placing her hand over his phone. He had the grace to look sheepish. "Old habits. Raylin sent an update about the Children's Foundation's new initiative." And, you're right." He tucked the phone away, pulling her closer instead. "The Empire can wait. This, us, matters more." From Venice, they travelled to a small village in Tuscany, staying in a converted monastery surrounded by rolling hills and ancient olive groves. Alexander discovered a different kind of peace here, away from the constant demands of his corporate world. He found himself sleeping later, laughing more, letting the warm Italian sun and Sophie's presence melt away years of carefully maintained control. They spent an afternoon learning to make pasta from an elderly nonna who spoke no English, but communicated perfectly through smiles and gentle hands, guiding their clumsy attempts at rolling dough. Flour dusted Sophie's cheek, and when Alexander kissed it away, the nonna clapped her hands in delight, rattling off rapid Italian that made their translator blush. "What did she say?" Sophie asked, curious. The translator, a local college student, grinned. "She says she hasn't seen such love since her own Giuseppe was alive. She says you have the eyes of newlyweds but the souls of old lovers." That night, enjoying their handmade pasta on the monastery's terrace under a canopy of stars, Alexander found himself sharing dreams he'd never voiced aloud. "I want to create something lasting," he said, swirling wine in his glass. "Not just stores or profit margins, but something that makes a real difference. The Children's Foundation is just the beginning." Sophie listened, her eyes reflecting the candlelight. "Tell me more." "I've been thinking about sustainable farming initiatives, partnering with local communities, creating opportunities for people who just need a chance, like I once did." He paused, suddenly vulnerable. "Is that too idealistic?" "No." Sophie reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "It's beautiful and achievable. We'll build it together." Their journey continued to the Greek islands, where they found a different kind of magic. On Santorini, their villa's infinity pool seemed to merge with the Aegean Sea, creating an endless horizon of blue. They spent lazy mornings swimming and reading, afternoons exploring ancient ruins, and evenings watching the famous sunset paint the whitewashed buildings in shades of gold and rose. One night, after a dinner of fresh seafood in a tiny taverna in Oia, they walked along the caldera edge, the moon casting silver light across the volcanic landscape. "Dance with me," Sophie said suddenly, pulling Alexander close. "Here? There's no music?" She began humming their wedding song, and they swayed together under the stars, the warm breeze carrying the scent of night-blooming jasmine. An old Greek woman passing by blessed them in her native tongue, pressing a sprig of herbs into Sophie's hand for luck and love. Their final destination was the Maldives, where their overwater villa became their private paradise. The Indian Ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, its waters shifting from turquoise to sapphire as the sun moved across the sky. They snorkeled among rainbow-colored fish, Sophie's delight at each new discovery making Alexander fall in love with her all over again. One morning, they took a sunset cruise on a traditional donie boat. As they floated on the gentle waves, Sophie noticed Alexander watching her with an intensity that made her heart skip. "What is it?" she asked, moving to sit beside him. "I was just thinking about that first board meeting," he said, pulling her close. "How different my life would be if you hadn't walked in that day with your revolutionary ideas and fearless spirit." "Different how?" "Empty," he said simply. "Successful, probably. Powerful, certainly. But empty." He traced her cheekbone with his thumb. "You filled all the spaces I didn't even know were hollow." Their days fell into a pattern of simple pleasures. Breakfast delivered by boat each morning, afternoons spent swimming in their private pool or reading in the shade of palm trees, evenings watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. Yet even in paradise, reality occasionally intruded. One afternoon, as they lounged on their deck, Alexander's phone buzzed with an urgent message from Marcus. A competitor was attempting a hostile takeover of a key supplier. The old Alexander would have immediately booked the next flight home, but now he simply forwarded the message to his legal team with clear instructions, then turned back to his wife. "Everything okay?" Sophie asked, noticing the brief frown that crossed his face. "Just business. Nothing that can't wait." He smiled, pulling her into the pool with him. "I have more important matters to attend to." They spent their last evening in the Maldives on a secluded beach, where the resort had set up a private dinner under the stars. Tiki torches flickered in the gentle breeze, and the sound of waves provided nature's perfect soundtrack. "I don't want this to end," Sophie admitted, her feet buried in the cool sand. "Who says it has to?" Alexander pulled her close. "The location might change, but this is forever. Even when we're back in Seattle, dealing with board meetings and quarterly reports. Especially then." He kissed her forehead. "You've taught me that life isn't about control and power. It's about moments like this, about building something meaningful together." Their return to Seattle brought them back to reality, but something fundamental had shifted. Their penthouse, which Alexander had once viewed simply as a place to sleep between meetings, became a home. Sophie filled it with warmth and personal touches, fresh flowers in every room, family photos on the walls, comfortable throws draped over the designer furniture. They fell into new routines that balanced work and intimacy. Morning coffee on their balcony became a sacred time, watching Seattle wake up while planning their day together. Board meetings were still professional, but there were secret smiles across the conference table, private jokes in elevator rides. One evening, about a week after their return, Sophie was preparing dinner in their kitchen. Another change, as Alexander had never used the space for anything but coffee before, when she suddenly felt dizzy. The room spun, and the knife she was holding clattered to the counter. "Sophie!" Alexander was at her side instantly, steadying her. "What's wrong?" "Just a little lightheaded," she assured him, though her face had gone pale. "Probably just jet lag still." But as he helped her to their sofa, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, something that would test their newfound paradise in ways they couldn't imagine. The next morning, Sophie insisted she was fine, brushing off his concerns as they prepared for an important board meeting. Victoria Pierce, their head of marketing, was presenting a new initiative that would dovetail with the Children's Foundation's work. As Victoria began her presentation, Sophie felt the room start to spin again. She gripped the edge of the conference table, trying to focus on the slides being shown. Alexander noticed her distress immediately, his hand finding hers under the table. "We'll continue this later," he announced, cutting Victoria off mid-sentence. "Take an early lunch, everyone." As the board members filed out, Sophie leaned against him, her usual vibrant energy notably diminished. "I should see a doctor," she admitted quietly. "I'll have Ray Lynn clear my schedule. I'm coming with you." "No, you have that merger meeting this afternoon. It's important." She squeezed his hand. "I'll ask my friend Olivia to go with me. She's a nurse at Seattle Grace. She'll make sure I'm well taken care of." Alexander hesitated, his protective instincts warring with his trust in Sophie's judgment. "Promise you'll call me as soon as you know anything." "Of course." She kissed him softly. "I'm sure it's nothing serious." What neither of them could know as they parted ways that afternoon was that their love story was about to face its greatest challenge. The test would come not from outside forces or business rivals, but from the very joy they had created together, a joy that would soon be twisted by misunderstanding and betrayal into something that threatened to tear their carefully built paradise apart. But for now, they were still in their honeymoon phase, their love seemingly unshakable. Alexander watched Sophie leave with Olivia, his heart full of both concern and endless affection. In his office, he found himself unable to focus on the merger documents, his mind returning again and again to the way Sophie had looked that morning. Pale but still beautiful, strong but suddenly vulnerable. He picked up his phone to call her, then set it down again. Trust, he reminded himself, was the foundation they had built their relationship on. She would tell him everything when she was ready. As the Seattle afternoon faded into evening, Alexander stood at his office window, watching the city lights begin to twinkle on. Somewhere out there, his wife was getting answers to questions he didn't yet know to ask. Their paradise was about to be tested in ways they couldn't imagine, but the love they had found in each other would prove to be either their salvation or their undoing. The sun set over Elliott Bay, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded him of their evening in Santorini. Alexander touched his wedding ring, a habit he'd developed whenever he thought of Sophie, and smiled. Whatever came next, they would face it together. After all, the best stories were the ones that surprised you. Chapter 5. Whispers of Joy and Shadows of Doubt, Seattle. Grace Hospital's pristine corridors seemed endless as Sophie followed Olivia through the maze of medical wings. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow that made her feel even more unsettled than she already was. Her friend's nursing uniform rustled softly as they walked, the sound oddly comforting in the sterile environment. "Dr. Bennett is the best OB/GYN in Seattle," Olivia assured her, squeezing her hand. "She'll take good care of you." The examination room was warmer than the hallway, decorated with soft colors and nature photographs that did little to calm Sophie's racing heart. As she changed into the hospital gown, her mind wandered to Alexander. He would be in his merger meeting now, probably commanding the room with his usual authority, unaware that their world might be about to change forever. Dr. Bennett proved to be a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and an air of quiet competence that immediately put Sophie at ease. The examination was thorough, followed by blood work and an ultrasound that made Sophie's breath catch in her throat. "Congratulations, Mrs. Sterling," Dr. Bennett said with a warm smile, turning the ultrasound screen so Sophie could see better. "You're about 8 weeks pregnant and—" She moved the wand slightly. "It appears you're carrying twins." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Sophie stared at the screen, at the two tiny flickering heartbeats that represented new life, her children, hers and Alexander's. Tears spilled down her cheeks as joy, unlike anything she'd ever known, filled her heart. "Twins," she whispered, touching the screen gently. "Oh my God, twins." Olivia, who had stayed for moral support, was practically bouncing with excitement. "This is amazing! Alexander is going to be over the moon!" But as Dr. Bennett discussed prenatal care and scheduled follow-up appointments, a plan began forming in Sophie's mind. Alexander had mentioned over breakfast just that morning that the annual Sterling Provisions Gala was coming up in 3 days, the company's biggest event of the year, where they announced their major initiatives and celebrated their successes. What better way to tell him, she mused aloud as she and Olivia left the hospital. It's perfect timing. All our friends and family will be there. I can make it so special for him. Are you sure you want to wait? Olivia asked, concern touching her voice. 3 days is a long time to keep such big news to yourself. It's just 3 days, Sophie insisted, and it will be worth it to see his face when I tell him in front of everyone who matters to us. You'll help me plan it, won't you? Olivia agreed, but something in her expression suggested hesitation. Just be careful, Sophie. News like this has a way of getting out. Neither woman noticed Victoria Pierce standing in the hospital coffee shop, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of their animated conversation. The marketing executive had come to visit her mother, who was recovering from minor surgery, but fate had handed her something far more interesting than hospital coffee. Victoria had always resented Sophie's meteoric rise within Sterling Provisions. The younger woman had swept in with her innovative ideas and genuine charm, capturing not just the company's attention, but its CEO's heart as well. Now she was living the life Victoria had always dreamed of, married to one of Seattle's most eligible bachelors, wielding influence both in the boardroom and the charitable sector. As she watched Sophie and Olivia leave, Victoria's mind began working overtime. Information was power, and she had just stumbled upon the most valuable information of all. The question was, how best to use it? Back at Sterling Provisions, Alexander was concluding the merger meeting when Raylan slipped him a note. Sophie called. She's fine, just tired from the honeymoon, taking the rest of the day off to rest. Relief flooded through him, though a nagging worry remained. He'd never known Sophie to take sick days, even when she actually was ill. Still, trust was the foundation of their relationship. If she said she was fine, he would believe her. The next 2 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation for the gala. Sophie threw herself into the planning with unusual enthusiasm, working closely with the event coordinators to ensure every detail was perfect. She had arranged for a special moment during Alexander's speech, a surprise announcement that would change their lives forever. Victoria, meanwhile, had been doing some digging of her own. Through carefully casual conversations with hospital staff and strategic calls to old contacts, she began piecing together a very different narrative. Sophie's previous employment at Morrison Foods, their biggest competitor, took on new significance when viewed through a jealous lens. The morning of the gala, Victoria made a call to James Morrison himself. "Mr. Morrison, I have some information you might find interesting about Sterling Provisions and its CEO's new wife." Sophie spent the day of the gala in a state of nervous excitement. She had chosen her dress carefully, a flowing emerald green gown that complemented her coloring while cleverly concealing any hint of her condition. Olivia helped her prepare, their girlish excitement reminiscent of their college days. "Are you absolutely sure about waiting?" Olivia asked one final time as she helped Sophie with her jewelry. "Positive," Sophie smiled, touching her still flat stomach gently. "Tonight will be perfect. Alexander deserves something special." The Seattle Art Museum had been transformed for the gala. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the elegant crowd, and the scent of roses filled the air. Sophie moved through the gathering with natural grace, greeting board members and charitable partners, all while protecting her precious secret. She spotted Alexander across the room, commanding attention in his tuxedo as he discussed business with a group of investors. Their eyes met over the crowd, and his whole face softened with love. He excused himself and made his way to her side. "You look stunning," he murmured, kissing her cheek. "Are you feeling better?" "Never better," she assured him, squeezing his hand. "Tonight is going to be special." As Alexander took the stage for his keynote address, Sophie's heart raced with anticipation. She had arranged for a special slide to be inserted at the end of his presentation, an ultrasound image with the simple words, "Baby Sterling coming soon, ×2. But fate and Victoria Pierce had other plans. Just as Alexander was concluding his speech about Sterling Provision's vision for the future, a murmur went through the crowd. Phones began buzzing with notifications, and Sophie watched in horror as people began pulling up social media posts. The images were innocent enough, photos of her and James Morrison from her time working at his company. But the captions were poison. Sterling Provision's CEO's wife, corporate spy. Inside source reveals shocking truth about Sophie Cambridge's past. Sophie felt the room spin as she watched Alexander's face change, his eyes finding hers across the crowd. The warmth she was used to seeing there had been replaced by something cold and terrible. Betrayal. The carefully planned revelation of their joy turned to ashes in her mouth as Alexander strode from the stage, his face a mask of controlled fury. The crowd parted before him like water, whispers following in his wake. "Alexander, wait," Sophie started, reaching for him. "I can explain everything." But the look in his eyes stopped her cold. "Explain what?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. "How long you've been feeding information to Morrison? Was that your plan all along? Get close to me, gain my trust, and then destroy everything I've built?" "No, that's not—" Sophie's protest was cut short as another wave of dizziness hit her. The stress, the excitement, the horror of the moment, it was all too much. "I trusted you," Alexander continued, each word like ice. "I let you into my life, my company, my heart. Was any of it real?" Sophie reached for him, desperate to make him understand, but the world was growing dark at the edges. "Alexander, please, the babies." But before she could finish, consciousness slipped away. The last thing she saw was Alexander's face, confusion replacing anger for just a moment before everything went black. She awoke in Seattle Grace Hospital once again, but this time there was no joy in the sterile room. Olivia sat beside her bed, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Sophie," she whispered. "Victoria. She overheard us at the hospital. She sold the story to Morrison for $20,000. Sophie touched her stomach protectively, her other hand reaching for the space where her wedding ring should have been. But the ring was gone, taken while she was unconscious, along with all her dreams of a perfect family. "Alexander?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from Olivia's expression. "He left orders that you're not to return to the penthouse or the office. His lawyers will be in touch." Olivia hesitated, then added softly, "He doesn't know about the babies. You passed out before you could tell him." Sophie turned to face the window, where Seattle's eternal rain matched the tears streaming down her face. In the space of one evening, she had lost everything: her husband, her home, her job, her reputation. All that remained were the tiny lives growing inside her, the last precious gift from a love that had burned too bright and ended too soon. "Don't try to contact him," she said finally, her voice hollow. "If he believes I could betray him like that, if he trusts scandal over his own wife—" She placed both hands over her stomach, where their children grew, unknowing. Then maybe we're better off without him. Outside, the city lights blurred through her tears, each one a reminder of the dreams that had shattered like crystal on marble floors. Somewhere out there, Alexander was probably drafting press releases, damage control strategies, all the things he did so well. The man who had learned to laugh again was gone, replaced by the cold businessman she had first met in that boardroom. But Sophie had her own strength, and now she had something even more precious to protect. She would leave Seattle, leave behind the glittering world of corporate power plays and society galas. She would build a new life, one where her children would never know the pain of betrayal or the cold touch of doubt. As night fell over the city, two hearts that had beaten as one now bore matching scars. But while Alexander's walls grew higher than ever, reinforced by what he saw as the ultimate betrayal, Sophie's heart remained open, forced to be strong not just for herself, but for the new lives she carried, lives that would bind them together forever, though he didn't yet know it. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of their perfect paradise, leaving behind only shadows of what might have been and the faint promise of what still could be. Chapter 6. Shattered Dreams and Silent Truths. Rain pounded against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander's penthouse office, the weather matching his dark mood. 3 days had passed since the gala, since his world had imploded in a cascade of betrayal and exposed secrets. The morning papers lay scattered across his desk, each headline a fresh wound. Sterling Provisions stock drops amid corporate espionage scandal. Society's perfect couple, a facade of lies. Sophie Cambridge, double agent or wronged wife. The last one made him hurl his coffee mug against the wall, the sound of shattering porcelain oddly satisfying. Raylin appeared silently with a towel and fresh coffee, her usual efficiency tinged with concern. "The board is assembled, Mr. Sterling," she said quietly, "and your lawyers have the divorce papers ready." Alexander nodded, straightening his tie with hands that weren't quite steady. The man in the window's reflection was a stranger, eyes hard as granite, mouth set in a grim line, all traces of the happiness from his honeymoon erased as if they'd never existed. In the boardroom, Marcus Chen watched his friend and CEO with growing worry. The Alexander who had returned from his honeymoon full of plans and dreams was gone, replaced by someone colder than he'd ever been before. Even during the presentation of quarterly projections, Alexander's thoughts seemed elsewhere, his responses mechanical. "And what about the Children's Foundation?" Marcus asked carefully. "The initiative Sophie was leading. Ms. Cambridge no longer has any association with Sterling Provisions or its charitable endeavors." Alexander cut him off, his voice arctic. "Reassign the projects and have IT remove her access to all company systems immediately." Marcus exchanged glances with Raylin, who stood in her usual corner taking notes. They both remembered how Alexander had been before Sophie, driven but distant, successful but solitary. Now he was becoming something worse, bitter. Across the city, in a private room at Seattle Grace Hospital, Sophie was facing her own demons. Dr. Bennett had insisted on keeping her under observation, concerned about the stress's impact on her pregnancy. "Your blood pressure is still higher than I'd like," the doctor said gently, reviewing her charts. "You need rest, calm, and support. Do you have somewhere to go when we release you?" Sophie thought of the penthouse she'd called home, of the life she'd built with Alexander. All of it gone, turned to ash by lies and misunderstandings. "My grandmother Eleanor lives in Pine Valley," she said quietly. "It's a small town in the mountains, about 3 hours from here." "That sounds perfect, Doctor." Bennett smiled. "Clean mountain air, peace and quiet, exactly what you and these little ones need." Olivia arrived that afternoon with a small suitcase of Sophie's things, all she'd been able. to retrieve from the penthouse before security escorted her out. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, hugging her friend. "This is all my fault. If I hadn't been so excited at the hospital—" "No," Sophie stopped her. "Victoria made her choice. She's the one who sold me out to Morrison." She touched her still flat stomach, where her babies grew unaware of the chaos around them. "I just need to focus on what matters now." Later that night, unable to sleep in the uncomfortable hospital bed, Sophie found herself watching the city lights through her window. Somewhere out there, Alexander was probably working late as usual, buried in his empire of numbers and acquisitions. Did he miss her? Did he lie awake at night too, remembering their happiness? She thought of their last morning together, how he'd kissed her goodbye before the gala, promising to make time for a weekend getaway soon. How could everything have fallen apart so quickly? In his penthouse, Alexander was indeed awake, standing in what had been their bedroom. Sophie's scent still lingered on her pillow, jasmine and something uniquely her. Her books still lined the shelves, her favorite throw still draped across the reading chair by the window, every object a reminder of what he'd lost, or rather, what had never truly been his. He picked up a framed photo from their honeymoon, both of them laughing on that beach in Santorini, so in love, so foolishly trusting. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the empty apartment as the frame hit the wall. "Was any of it real?" he whispered to the empty room. "Or was I just another acquisition target?" Morning brought no peace to either of them. As Sophie prepared to leave the hospital, Alexander sat in his office reviewing the evidence Victoria had compiled. Photos of Sophie with James Morrison, time-stamped emails that seemed suspicious out of context, meeting records that painted a picture of careful infiltration. But something nagged at him, a detail that didn't quite fit. In one photo, Sophie was laughing at something Morrison had said, her head thrown back in that unguarded way she had. The date stamp showed it was taken 3 years ago, long before she'd joined Sterling Provisions, before she'd met Alexander. "Raylin," he called, his voice rough, "get me everything we have on Sophie's employment history at Morrison Foods. Everything." His assistant hesitated. "Sir, there's something else you should know. Ms. Pierce... What about her? She's been seen meeting with Morrison's people several times over the past few months. The security team just brought me the surveillance photos this morning." Alexander's world tilted again, but this time with a different kind of vertigo. Could he have been wrong? Had he let his old fears and trust issues blind him to the truth? But before he could pursue that thought, his phone buzzed with a message from his lawyers. The divorce papers were ready for his signature. In a cruel twist of fate, they had been prepared by the same firm that had handled their prenuptial agreement just months ago. At that moment, Sophie was checking out of the hospital, refusing to let Olivia see her tears. "I'll call when I'm settled," she promised her friend, "but please don't tell anyone where I've gone, especially not Alexander." "But Sophie, if you'd just let me explain to him about the babies—" "No." Sophie's voice was firm despite her tears. "He chose to believe the worst of me without even giving me a chance to explain. He threw away everything we built together based on a few photos and rumors. These children deserve better than a father who trusts scandal over love." The taxi ride to the bus station was a blur of rain-streaked windows and memories. Every street held echoes of their happiness. The restaurant where they'd had their first date, the park where he'd surprised her with lunch on warm days, the children's hospital where they'd first volunteered together. As the bus pulled away from Seattle, Sophie allowed herself one last look at the skyline, dominated by Sterling Provisions Tower. Somewhere in that glass and steel monument to success, Alexander was probably signing the papers that would end their marriage, never knowing he was also signing away his right to know his children. In his office, Alexander's pen hovered over the signature line of the divorce papers. The same hand that had so confidently signed their marriage license now trembled slightly. Images flashed through his mind. Sophie's face when he'd proposed, their first dance as husband and wife, quiet mornings sharing coffee and dreams. He remembered her collapse at the gala, the way she'd reached for him, trying to say something about babies before consciousness slipped away. Had he been so blinded by rage that he'd missed something crucial? But then his eyes fell on the photos again, on the evidence of what he saw as betrayal, and his heart hardened once more. The pen scratched across paper, the sound like ice cracking over deep water. That evening, two souls lay awake in different places. Sophie on a bus heading toward mountains and sanctuary, Alexander in his empty penthouse surrounded by the trappings of success that suddenly meant nothing. Sophie watched the scenery change through the bus window, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. "We'll be okay," she whispered to her unborn children. "We'll build a new life, a good life. And someday, when you ask about your father, I'll tell you about the man he was when he knew how to love, not the one who let fear destroy everything." In his penthouse, Alexander stood at his window watching the same stars, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. The city spread before him like a carpet of lights, his empire of glass and steel a poor substitute for the warmth he'd known in Sophie's arms. A notification lit up his phone. Another tabloid story, another speculation about their failed marriage. He switched it off without reading it, suddenly tired of the noise, the scandal, the endless cycle of accusation and defense. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember their last happy morning. Sophie in his shirt making coffee, her hair messed from sleep, humming their wedding song. Had there been signs he'd missed? Clues that might have changed everything if he'd only been paying attention? But it was too late for such questions now. The papers were signed, the die cast. All that remained was to rebuild the walls she'd once helped him tear down, making them higher and stronger than ever. Neither of them slept that night. One rocked by the gentle motion of a bus heading toward a new life, the other standing sentinel over a city that had lost its magic. Both haunted by memories of paradise lost, both protecting their hearts in different ways. What they couldn't know was that fate wasn't finished with them yet. The truth would eventually surface, like air bubbles rising through deep water. But for now, they remained separated by pride, fear, and misunderstanding, each protecting a piece of their shared heart in the only way they knew how. As dawn broke over the Cascade Mountains, Sophie caught her first glimpse of Pine Valley nestled in the morning mist. It looked like something from a fairy tale, peaceful, untouched by the corporate wars and society scandals of Seattle. A place to heal, to rebuild, to prepare for the most important role of her life, mother to Alexander's children, though he might never know them. In Seattle, Alexander watched the same sunrise paint his city gold, unaware that with each passing moment he was losing more than just a wife. He was losing the chance to know his own children, to be the father he'd never had, to create the family he'd secretly always wanted. The sun rose fully, beginning a new day that would find them further apart than ever, yet connected by the precious secret Sophie carried. Time, tide, and truth would eventually have their say, but for now the silence between them echoed with unspoken words and unnamed regrets. Chapter 7. New Beginnings and Hidden Truths. Pine Valley greeted autumn with a symphony of colors. Maples blazing red against dark evergreens, aspens shimmering gold in the mountain breeze. The small town nestled in its valley like a jewel in a verdant setting, far removed from Seattle's glass and steel canyons. Eleanor's cottage sat on the outskirts of town, its garden still blooming with late roses and hardy chrysanthemums. The morning mist was just lifting as Sophie carried her single suitcase up the lavender-lined path, her grandmother waiting on the porch with open arms. "Oh, my dear girl," Eleanor whispered, holding Sophie close. At 72, she still stood straight as a pine tree, her silver hair caught in a neat braid, her eyes wise and kind. "You're safe now. You're home." The cottage was exactly as Sophie remembered from childhood summers. Warm wood floors worn smooth by generations of footsteps, windows gleaming with handmade lace curtains, the scent of fresh bread and herbs hanging in the air. Everything about it spoke of comfort, of tradition, of healing. "Your room is ready," Eleanor said, leading the way upstairs. "I've kept it, just as you left it." She paused, then added softly, "Though we'll need to make some changes now, won't we? For when the little ones arrive." Sophie touched her stomach, just beginning to show at 12 weeks. "I don't know how to do this, Gran. How to be a single mother. How to protect them from all the ugliness. The same way we've always done everything in this family," Eleanor replied, her voice strong and sure. "One day at a time, with love and courage." In Seattle, Alexander was facing his own kind of autumn. The divorce papers had been filed, the press releases crafted with careful precision, the narrative controlled as much as possible. But something kept nagging at him, like a splinter under his skin. "Show me the surveillance photos again," he demanded, pacing his office while Raylin spread them across his desk. All of them, including the ones of Victoria. The pictures told a story, but was it the right one? In the photos of Sophie with Morrison, she looked younger, more casual. These were clearly from her previous employment, but the photos of Victoria meeting Morrison's people were recent, taken in dark parking garages and out-of-the-way restaurants. "Run a complete audit of Victoria's communications," he ordered. "Every email, every phone call, every meeting for the past year, and get me Morrison's quarterly reports. I want to see exactly when their strategies started mirroring ours." Back in Pine Valley, Sophie was beginning to find her rhythm. The local tourist office had hired her as a guide, her knowledge of business and presentation skills making her a natural fit for corporate retreat groups who came to the mountain for team building. "You have a gift," her boss, Michael, told her after watching her handle a particularly difficult group. "You make people feel seen, understood. It's rare." The irony wasn't lost on Sophie. How Alexander had once seen her so clearly, only to become blind when it mattered most. She thanked Michael and headed home through the golden afternoon, one hand resting on her growing belly. The twins were active today, making their presence known with gentle movements that still amazed her. Dr. Anderson, the local physician, had confirmed they were fraternal twins, a boy and a girl. Sophie found herself talking to them as she walked, telling them stories about the mountains, about the changing seasons, about everything except their father. Eleanor was waiting on the porch when Sophie arrived home, a worried look on her face. "There's been a call," she said quietly, "from Olivia in Seattle. Victoria Pierce has been asking questions about you, trying to find out where you've gone." Sophie felt her heart race, her protective instincts flaring. She's done enough damage. What more could she want? "Perhaps she's beginning to regret her actions," Eleanor suggested, but Sophie shook her head. "People like Victoria don't regret, Gran. They just look for new ways to profit from others' pain." In his Seattle penthouse, Alexander stood at his window, watching the city lights come alive. The audit of Victoria's activities had revealed some troubling patterns. Not only had she been meeting with Morrison's people, but there were unexplained deposits in her offshore accounts that coincided with major sterling provisions announcements. "Sir," Raylin's voice was careful as she entered with another stack of reports. "We've found something else. The original photos of Sophie with Morrison, they've been digitally altered. The timestamps were changed." Alexander felt the floor shift under his feet. "What?" "Our tech team compared them to the originals we obtained from Morrison Foods archives. The photos were taken during a company picnic 3 years ago, long before Ms. Cambridge joined Sterling Provisions. Victoria had them modified to appear more recent." The whiskey glass in Alexander's hand shattered, amber liquid mixing with blood where the glass had cut his palm. But he barely felt the pain. All he could think about was Sophie's face at the gala, the way she'd reached for him, trying to tell him something before she collapsed. "Find her," he ordered, his voice raw. "Whatever it takes, find Sophie." But Sophie had disappeared as completely as morning mist in the mountain sun. Pine Valley protected its own, and newcomers trying to ask questions about the quiet young woman who led hiking tours were met with polite but firm silence. As autumn deepened into winter, Sophie's belly grew along with her confidence. The cottage's second bedroom was transformed into a nursery, Eleanor's skilled hands turning second-hand furniture into treasures with paint and love. The walls bloomed with hand-painted mountains and forests, a peaceful scene for the babies to grow into. "Tell me about their father," Eleanor said one evening as they sat by the fire working on tiny knitted sweaters. "Not the man who sent you away, but the one you fell in love with." Sophie's hand stilled on her knitting. "He was different when he let his guards down. Funny in a quiet way, brilliant but also kind when he allowed himself to be. He played the piano late at night when he couldn't sleep, thought I didn't know. He had this laugh that made you feel like you'd won a prize just by causing it, and he never knew about the babies. I tried to tell him that night at the gala, but he was so angry, so ready to believe the worst." Sophie wiped away tears with the back of her hand. "These children will never know that version of their father. They'll never hear his laugh or feel his love, and that's his choice." But even as she spoke, one of the twins kicked strongly, as if protesting this. "Verdict." Sophie rubbed her belly, soothing them. "It's okay, little ones. We have everything we need right here." In Seattle, Alexander's investigation into Victoria's activities had opened a Pandora's box of deception. The evidence was mounting, not of Sophie's betrayal, but of Victoria's calculated destruction of their marriage. "She's been selling information to Morrison for years," Marcus reported, laying out the proof. "The photos of Sophie were just her insurance policy in case anyone got too close to discovering the truth." Alexander stood at his office window, watching snow begin to fall over the city. "I drove her away, Marcus. I didn't even give her a chance to explain. I let my past, my trust issues, blind me to what was right in front of me." "She's out there somewhere," Marcus said quietly. "The Sophie you fell in love with, the one who saw past your walls. She's out there." But where? Alexander had hired the best private investigators, searched every lead, and still found nothing. It was as if Sophie had vanished into thin air, taking with her any chance of redemption. In Pine Valley, snow blanketed the mountains in pristine white. Sophie stood on Eleanor's porch, watching the flakes dance in the light of the setting sun. At 7 months pregnant, she had to wade carefully through the deep snow. But she loved these quiet moments when the world seemed to hold its breath. The babies were especially active in the evenings, their movements a constant reminder of the miracle growing inside her. Sometimes, in the deepest part of night, she would find herself wondering if Alexander would have been happy about the twins. Would he have played piano for them as he used to play for her? Would he have read them stories in that gentle voice he used only in their most private moments? But then she would remember his face at the gala, the cold fury in his eyes, the way he had been so ready to believe the worst of her. No, she decided again and again, her children deserved better than a father who could throw away love so easily. The Winter Festival was approaching, Pine Valley's biggest event of the year. Sophie had been asked to help coordinate the cultural activities, her experience with the Sterling Provisions galas proving invaluable on a smaller scale. "You've brought new life to this town," Michael told her as they reviewed the festival plans, "not just with the babies coming, but with your ideas, your energy. Pine Valley needed someone like you." Sophie smiled, touching her belly as one of the twins performed what felt like a somersault. Pine Valley saved me. It's only fair I give something back. What she didn't know was that fate was preparing to test her sanctuary. In Seattle, Victoria's carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. Under pressure from the evidence Alexander had accumulated, she had finally broken down and confessed everything. "I'll tell you where to find her," Victoria had said, her composure finally cracking. "But you should know, she was trying to tell you something at the gala, something important." Alexander's heart had stopped for a moment. What was it? But Victoria just shook her head. "That's not my secret to tell, but if you want to find her, try Pine Valley. She has family there." Now, as snow fell on both city and mountain town, two hearts beat with renewed purpose, one seeking redemption, the other protecting new life. The truth was finally breaking free, like spring water under winter ice, but would it come in time to heal what had been broken? In her cottage bedroom, Sophie sat in the window seat, watching the snow fall and singing softly to her unborn children. The lullaby was one Alexander had once played on the piano, though she never told anyone that. Some memories were too precious to share, even in their pain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new fears. But for now, she had this moment of peace, surrounded by love, both born and unborn, in a place where healing seemed possible, even if forgiveness still felt like a distant dream. Chapter 8. Paths. Crossing. The Winter Festival transformed Pine Valley into a wonderland of lights and music. Fresh snow draped the town like white velvet, strings of twinkling lights reflected in its pristine surface. At 8 months pregnant, Sophie moved carefully through the festival preparations. Her clipboard clutched against her prominent belly as she directed volunteers. "Mrs. Sterling," a young volunteer called out, then caught herself. "I mean, Miss Cambridge." Sophie's heart twisted at the slip, but she kept her smile steady. "What is it, Jenny?" "The Seattle Business Group's bus is delayed because of the snow. They won't arrive until tomorrow morning." Sophie nodded, making a note. The corporate retreat groups were vital to Pine Valley's economy, even more so during the festival. This particular group had booked the entire Pine Valley Lodge, though their company name hadn't been specified, just another Seattle corporation seeking mountain air and team building. What Sophie couldn't know was that the delayed bus carried Alexander Sterling himself, along with a carefully selected team from Sterling Provisions. He had chosen Pine Valley for their annual executive retreat after weeks of investigating Sophie's whereabouts, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight that greeted him the next morning. Dawn painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold as their bus finally wound its way into the valley. Alexander stood at the front of the bus, one hand braced against the ceiling, his eyes scanning the picturesque town. Something about this place called to him, perhaps its peace, so different from Seattle's constant motion. "The local guide will meet us at 9, Marcus informed him quietly. "They're supposed to be excellent, especially with corporate groups." Alexander merely nodded, his mind already racing ahead. Was Sophie here? Would she speak to him if she were? The weight of Victoria's signed confession sat heavy in his briefcase, along with the proof of her years-long deception. The Pine Valley Lodge exceeded expectations, its rustic luxury a perfect blend of comfort and mountain charm. Alexander found himself drawn to the massive stone fireplace in the lobby, where a well-loved piano sat waiting for skilled hands. "The festival begins tonight," the lodge manager explained enthusiastically. "Your timing is perfect. The whole town comes alive with music, food, local crafts. And wait until you meet your guide. She's revolutionized our corporate programs." Alexander's heart skipped at the pronoun, but he kept his face neutral. Looking forward to it. At precisely 9, the lodge's double doors opened, letting in a swirl of snow and winter air. Alexander turned, and the world stopped turning. Sophie stood in the doorway, wrapped in a dark blue parka that did little to hide her pregnant condition. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her auburn hair dusted with snowflakes, and her hands rested protectively over her rounded belly. She hadn't seen him yet, focused on removing her snow-covered boots. The sight hit Alexander like a physical blow. Pregnant. Sophie was pregnant. His mind raced back to the gala, to her collapse, to the words she'd tried to say about babies. The room swam around him as realization crashed through his carefully constructed walls. Before he could move or speak, Sophie looked up. Their eyes met across the lobby, and time seemed to freeze. All the color drained from her face, her hand gripping the doorframe for support. I need to—" she stammered, then turned and fled into the snowy morning. Alexander started to follow, but Marcus caught his arm. "Give her a minute," his friend advised. "This is a shock for both of you." Minutes later, Michael, the tourism office director, arrived apologetically. "I'm so sorry, but Miss Cambridge has taken ill. I'll be your guide today instead." The day passed in a blur for Alexander. While Michael led the group through team-building exercises, his mind was consumed with the image of Sophie, with the undeniable evidence of what he had thrown away. Twins, he learned, through careful questioning of the chatty lodge staff. She was carrying twins. That evening, unable to sleep, he found himself at the piano in the empty lobby. His fingers moved of their own accord, playing the lullaby he used to practice late at night in their penthouse, when he thought Sophie was sleeping. The melody drifted through the lodge like a ghost of happier times. Unknown to him, Sophie stood in the shadows of the back entrance, one hand pressed to her mouth to hold back sobs, the other cradling her belly where their children stirred at the familiar music. The babies were always most active when there was music, as if they had inherited their father's hidden talent. "He's here," she whispered later that night to Eleanor, pacing their cottage living room. "Why is he here? How did he find us?" Eleanor watched her granddaughter with wise eyes. "Perhaps it's time, dear one, time for truth to have its say." "The truth?" Sophie laughed bitterly. "The truth is, he believed the worst of me without a second thought. The truth is, he threw away everything we built together based on lies and manipulated evidence. The truth is—" "The truth," Eleanor interrupted gently, "is that you're both hurting, and these babies deserve to know both sides of their story." The next morning, a fresh blanket of snow covered Pine Valley, muffling sounds and softening edges. Alexander stood on the lodge's wraparound porch, watching the sun rise over the mountains. The sight reminded him of mornings in Santorini, of Sophie's joy at each new day. A movement caught his eye, Sophie making her way carefully along the shoveled path toward the festival grounds. She wore a different parka today, dark green against the snow, and even from a distance he could see how she cradled her belly, protecting their children. Their children. The thought hit him again with fresh force. He had lost not just his wife, but his chance to be a father. All because he had let old fears and trust issues blind him to what mattered most. Without conscious thought, he found himself following her path through town. Sophie moved with practiced ease despite her condition, greeting townspeople by name, stopping to admire children's snow sculptures. This was her world now, he realized. She had built a new life, while he had been drowning in bitterness and regret. The festival grounds were coming alive with early morning preparations. Alexander watched from behind a craft stall as Sophie directed volunteers, her natural leadership evident in every gesture. She was different here, more relaxed, more herself than she had ever been in Seattle's corporate world. "She's a blessing to this town," a voice said beside him. He turned to find an elderly woman watching him with knowing eyes. Eleanor, Sophie's grandmother. He recognized her from the few photos Sophie had shared. "Mrs. Harrison," he acknowledged quietly. "You've hurt her deeply, Alexander Sterling," Eleanor said without preamble, "but I think perhaps you're hurting too." "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice rough. "I let fear and old wounds blind me to what was real. Victoria Pierce confessed everything, the altered photos, the fake evidence, her years of selling information to Morrison. But by the time I learned the truth, by then, Sophie was gone." Eleanor nodded. "With two precious reasons to protect her heart." "Twins," Alexander whispered. "I'm going to be a father, and I've already failed them." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. "Perhaps. But failure isn't always final, Mr. Sterling, not unless we choose to make it so." Before he could respond, a commotion arose from the festival grounds. Sophie had slipped on a patch of ice, and though she hadn't fallen, the near miss had clearly shaken her. Alexander's body moved instinctively toward her, but Eleanor's hand on his arm stopped him. "Not yet," she said firmly. "She needs to know the truth first. All of it, including why you're really here in Pine Valley." Alexander watched helplessly as Michael and another guide helped Sophie to a nearby bench. Her hands were pressed to her belly, her face pale with shock. "The truth," he repeated softly. "I owe her that much. But will she even listen?" "Leave that to me," Eleanor smiled. "Come to the cottage tonight after the festival closes. It's the yellow one at the end of Maple Street, with the night-blooming jasmine by the porch." As Eleanor walked away, Alexander turned back to watch Sophie, who had recovered her composure and was once again directing festival preparations. She was so strong, his Sophie, strong enough to build a new life, to protect their children, to thrive despite everything he had put her through. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Alexander went through the motions of the corporate retreat activities, his mind constantly aware of Sophie's presence on the festival grounds. She was careful to stay away from the lodge, sending other guides to work with his group. As evening approached, the festival lights came on, turning Pine Valley into an enchanted scene of crystal and starlight. Alexander watched from the lodge porch as Sophie made her way home, her figure silhouetted against the snow until she disappeared around a corner. In the cottage, Sophie sat in her favorite window seat, watching the festival lights twinkle in the distance. The babies were restless tonight, perhaps sensing her turmoil. "You're sure about this?" she asked Eleanor for the 10th time. "Having him here, listening to whatever justification he's come up with?" "My dear," Eleanor replied patiently, "sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we need most, and those little ones deserve to know their whole story, not just the painful parts." As the festival's evening music drifted through the town, Alexander Sterling stood in front of a yellow cottage, his heart pounding like a teenager's. In his briefcase were the documents that proved Sophie's innocence. Victoria's confession, the evidence of her manipulation, the proof that could change everything. But would it be enough? Could any amount of evidence heal the wound of his mistrust, his failure to believe in their love when it mattered most? Snow began to fall again, soft and silent, as he raised his hand to knock. Inside, Sophie tensed at the sound, one hand pressed to her belly where their children stirred. The moment of truth had arrived, carried on winter winds and festival music in a small mountain town where two broken hearts might finally find their way back to what mattered most. Chapter 9. Truth in the Mountain. Snow. Eleanor opened the door to find Alexander standing in the gently falling snow. Looking more uncertain than she'd ever imagined Seattle's most powerful businessman could appear. The festival lights cast colored shadows across his face, highlighting the strain of the past months. "Come in," she said simply, stepping aside. Sophie's in the living room. The cottage's warmth enveloped him like an embrace, scents of cinnamon and wood smoke filling the air. Family photos lined the walls. Sophie through the years, her smile unchanging, even as she grew from a pigtailed child to the woman who had captured his heart. Recent photos showed her pregnancy's progression, each one a stark reminder of what he had missed. Sophie stood as he entered, one hand braced on the window seat, the other protectively cradling her belly. The oversized sweater she wore did nothing to hide her condition, and Alexander felt his heart constrict at the sight. She was more beautiful than ever, pregnancy giving her a glow that transcended their circumstances. "I'll make some tea," Eleanor announced, tactfully retreating to the kitchen. The sound of clinking china provided a gentle counterpoint to the crackling fireplace. For a long moment, neither spoke. The weight of unspoken words, of months of separation and pain, filled the space between them like invisible walls. "You look," Alexander started, then faltered. How could he possibly express everything he was feeling? "Sophie, Why are you here?" Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "How did you find me?" Alexander set his briefcase on the coffee table, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet room. "I've been looking for you since the truth about Victoria came out. She confessed everything, Sophie. The altered photos, the fake evidence, her years of selling information to Morrison. It was all a lie." Sophie's laugh held no humor. "And you needed her confession to believe that? The man I married, the man I loved, he should have known better. He should have trusted me." "You're right." The words came out rough with emotion. "I let my past, my trust issues, blind me to what was real. I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too afraid to believe in us." "It's not that simple anymore." Sophie's hands moved protectively over her belly as one of the twins kicked. "You didn't just hurt me, Alexander, you hurt them too." Alexander took a step forward, then stopped as she tensed. "Twins," he whispered. "At the gala. That's what you were trying to tell me. Before you threw me out without letting me explain?" "Yes." The bitterness in her voice cut like glass. "Before you chose to believe the worst of me, before you let your precious empire matter more than our love." "I was wrong," he said simply. "I've never been more wrong about anything in my life. When Victoria confessed, when I realized what I'd done..." He ran a hand through his hair, snow melting to mingle with unshed tears. "I've spent every day since then looking for you, hoping I wasn't too late to make things right." Eleanor returned with a tray of tea, the familiar ritual providing a moment of respite from the emotional tension. She poured 3 cups with careful precision, then settled into her armchair like a queen, holding court. "Perhaps," she suggested gently, "it's time for both of you to hear the whole truth, not just about Victoria's schemes, but about everything that's been left unsaid." Alexander opened his briefcase, removing a thick folder. "I have proof of everything. Victoria's confession, the original unaltered photos, bank records showing her payments from Morrison. She'd been selling company secrets for years, long before you joined Sterling Provisions. When she realized we were getting close to discovering her betrayal, she created this elaborate scheme to discredit you." Sophie accepted the folder, but didn't open it. "Do you think this changes everything? That showing me proof of what I already knew to be true somehow erases what happened?" "No," he answered quietly. "Nothing can erase what I did. But you deserve to know the whole story, even if you can never forgive me." As he spoke, one of the twins kicked strongly enough for Sophie to gasp, her hand flying to her side. Alexander moved instinctively toward her, stopping himself just short of touching her. "Are they..." He hesitated, his voice thick with emotion. "Are they healthy?" Something in his tone made Sophie soften slightly. "Yes, a boy and a girl. They're very active, especially when there's music. Like their father." The simple acknowledgement of his paternity brought tears to Alexander's eyes. "I've missed so much already. Their first movements, the ultrasounds preparing for their arrival." "You chose to miss it," Sophie reminded him, but her voice held more sadness than anger now. You chose to believe I could betray you, that everything we built together meant nothing. I was afraid, he admitted, sinking onto the sofa. Not of betrayal. Not really. I was afraid of how much I loved you, of how completely you had changed my world. When those photos appeared, it was like every fear I'd ever had came true at once. I retreated behind my walls without stopping to think, to feel, to remember who you really were. Eleanor watched them both with wise eyes. Fear, she said softly, can make us forget what our hearts know to be true. But love, real love, deserves a second chance to be heard. Sophie moved to sit in the window seat, her face illuminated by the festival lights outside. I used to watch you at night, she said suddenly. When you thought I was sleeping, you'd play the piano for hours, working through whatever was troubling you. The babies respond to that same lullaby now. They know their father's music, even if they've never known him. Alexander's breath caught. Sophie. I wanted to hate you, she continued, her voice trembling. When I left Seattle, when I found this sanctuary, I told myself it was better this way, that the babies and I would be fine on our own, that they didn't need a father who could throw away love so easily. She touched her belly as one of the twins moved. But they know. Somehow they know when you're near. They've been more active since you arrived in Pine Valley. He stood slowly, crossing the room to kneel beside her window seat. May I? He asked softly, his hand hovering near her belly. After a long moment, Sophie nodded. As Alexander's hand gently touched the spot where his children grew, one of the twins kicked firmly against his palm. A sob escaped him, years of carefully constructed control crumbling in the face of this miracle. I am so sorry, he whispered, his forehead resting against her knee. Sorry for doubting you, for letting fear destroy what we had, for missing these precious months. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but please, please don't let my mistakes cost these children their father. Sophie's hand moved of its own accord to touch his hair, the familiar texture bringing back a flood of memories. I never wanted them to grow up without you, she admitted softly. Even when I was angriest, I kept every sonogram picture, every milestone. I wrote letters about each doctor's appointment, each new development. I told myself it was for their baby books, but really, I couldn't bear the thought of you never knowing these moments. Eleanor quietly slipped out of the room, leaving them alone with their truth and their tears. Outside, the festival music drifted through the snowy night, carrying hints of healing on its melody. I've changed, Alexander said finally, raising his head to meet her eyes. These months without you, they've taught me what really matters. I've restructured the company, focused more on community impact than profit margins. The Children's Foundation has expanded beyond anything we dreamed. But none of it means anything without you, without our family. And if something like this happened again, Sophie challenged, if someone presented you with evidence, with doubts, I would remember this moment, he answered without hesitation. Remember the feel of our children moving beneath my hand. Remember the look in your eyes when you trusted me enough to share their first kick. I would remember that love, real love, deserves more than fear and doubt. As if in response to his words, both twins moved strongly, causing Sophie to laugh despite her tears. They're usually quiet this time of night, she said softly, but they know their father is finally here. Alexander stood, drawing her gently to her feet. Dance with me? He asked quietly. Like that first night at Canlis? I'm hardly built for dancing now, she protested, but allowed him to pull her close. You're perfect, he whispered, swaying with her to the distant festival music. You're everything I never knew I needed, everything I almost lost forever. They danced slowly in the firelight, her head eventually coming to rest on his shoulder as it had so many times before. The babies moved between them, creating their own rhythm of family and forgiveness. Stay, Sophie whispered finally. Not here, but in Pine Valley. Get to know this life I've built. Let me get to know the man you've become. Let us find our way back to each other slowly, properly. I'll stay as long as it takes, Alexander promised. I'll prove to you every day that I can be the husband and father you all deserve, the man who trusts in love more than fear. As midnight approached, snow still falling softly outside, two hearts began the delicate process of healing. In Eleanor's cottage, surrounded by the warmth of forgiveness and the promise of tomorrow, a family started to rebuild what fear had once torn apart. Chapter 10. Hearts Rekindling. Pine Valley Lodge had never hosted a guest quite like Alexander Sterling. The business titan who arrived with a corporate retreat group transformed into something entirely different, a man learning to slow down, to appreciate small moments, to rebuild what had been broken. He took a suite at the lodge, but spent most of his time at Eleanor's cottage, making up for lost months with quiet dedication. Each morning, he arrived with fresh pastries from the local bakery, having learned Sophie's pregnancy cravings. Each evening, he sat in the living room, learning every detail of the baby's development that he had missed. "Tell me again about their first ultrasound," he asked one snowy evening, his hand resting gently on Sophie's belly as they sat before the fire. Eleanor had tactfully retreated upstairs, leaving them to their gentle reconciliation. "I was so nervous," Sophie remembered, covering his hand with hers. "Olivia went with me, but all I could think was how much I wished you were there." Then Dr. Bennett pointed to the screen and said, "Well, look at that. 2 strong heartbeats." I started crying right there on the table. Alexander's thumb traced circles on her stomach, and one of the twins responded with a firm kick. "I'll never forgive myself for missing these moments." "Maybe that's not what matters now," Sophie said softly. "Maybe what matters is the moments we still have ahead of us." Their days fell into a pattern that felt both new and familiar. Alexander had Raylin restructure his schedule to run Sterling Provisions remotely, focusing only on essential decisions. Marcus handled the day-to-day operations in Seattle, sending daily reports that increasingly went unread as Alexander found himself more invested in local concerns. He joined Sophie's tour groups occasionally, watching with pride as she guided corporate teams through team-building exercises. Her natural ability to connect with people, to bring out their best selves. It was what had first drawn him to her in that boardroom so long ago. One afternoon, as snow began falling again, Alexander found himself helping Michael repair the tourism office's ancient heating system. The Alexander of 6 months ago wouldn't have known which end of a wrench to hold, but Pine Valley was teaching him new skills, new ways of measuring success. "You're different here," Sophie observed later, watching him build a fire in Eleanor's hearth. "More present." "I'm learning what really matters," he replied, sitting beside her on the sofa. "All those years building an empire, and I never realized the most important things can't be measured in profit margins." The babies were particularly active that evening, their movements visible through Sophie's sweater. Alexander had become attuned to their patterns. The boy was more active in the mornings, the girl preferred evenings, and both responded instantly to their father's voice. "Have you thought about names?" he asked hesitantly. They hadn't discussed this aspect yet, treading carefully around such intimate decisions. Sophie's hand found his. "I had some ideas, but I'd like us to decide together." That simple statement, the inclusion, the tentative trust it represented, brought tears to Alexander's eyes. "I'd like that," he managed. They spent the evening discussing names, sharing stories and memories that influenced their choices. Eleanor found them there hours later, surrounded by baby name books, Sophie's feet in Alexander's lap as he massaged her swollen ankles. The grandmother smiled knowingly. "I'm heading to bed. Don't stay up too late. You both need rest." But sleep was the last thing on either of their minds. The intimacy of planning their children's futures, of sharing hopes and fears, kept them talking long into the night. "I want them to know love first," Alexander said softly. "Not duty or expectations or fear of betrayal, just love, pure and simple. Like we knew before everything fell apart." "Better," he promised, "because we've learned what it costs to lose it and how precious second chances are." As her due date approached, Alexander's protective instincts went into overdrive. He had the lodge's maintenance team salt every walkway in town, installed handrails on Eleanor's porch, and kept Dr. Anderson's number on speed dial. "You can't bubble wrap the whole town," Sophie teased, but her heart warmed at his dedication. The nursery became their joint project. Alexander's business acumen proved surprisingly useful in organizing the space efficiently, while Sophie's artistic touch made it feel magical. They painted the walls together one weekend, turning it into an enchanted forest scene with mountains like the ones visible from the window. "I used to dream about this," Sophie admitted as they worked. "When I first found out about the twins, I would imagine you helping set up their room, picking out furniture, arguing over color schemes." Alexander set down his paintbrush, turning to face her. "I want to be part of everything now. Every decision, every moment, every scraped knee and midnight feeding. If you'll let me—" Sophie's response was interrupted by a sharp intake of breath, her hand flying to her belly. "What is it?" Alexander was at her side instantly, panic edging his voice. "Braxton Hicks contractions," she assured him. "I've been having them for weeks, but maybe we should take a break." He insisted on running her a warm bath, complete with the lavender oil Dr. Anderson had recommended for relaxation. As Sophie soaked, Alexander sat on the bathroom floor beside the tub, reading aloud from a book of fairy tales they'd bought for the twins. "They love your voice," Sophie murmured, half asleep in the warm water. "They always settle down when you read to them." The intimacy of the moment, him reading to his unborn children while their mother drifted in peaceful waters, struck Alexander with its simple perfection. This was what he had almost lost forever, what his fear had nearly destroyed. That night, a spring storm rolled through the valley, bringing thunder that rattled the cottage windows. Alexander, who had been about to leave for the lodge, found himself invited to stay in Eleanor's guest room. "No sense driving in this weather," the grandmother declared with suspicious timing. Unable to sleep, Alexander wandered downstairs to find Sophie in her usual window seat, watching the storm. "The thunder keeps them awake," she explained as he joined her. "They're going to be night owls like their father." Without thinking, Alexander placed his hand on her belly, feeling their children's restless movements. Sophie covered his hand with hers, and suddenly the distance between them seemed to vanish. "I miss you," he whispered. "Every day, every moment. I miss the life we had, the future we planned." "I miss you too," she admitted. "Even when I was angriest, I missed you. The babies would move and I'd turn to tell you only to remember." Alexander gathered her close, careful of her belly. "I'm here now, for all of it, for every kick and hiccup and sleepless night." They sat together in the darkness, watching lightning illuminate the mountains, feeling their children dance to nature's symphony. When Sophie finally dozed off against his shoulder, Alexander carried her carefully to her bed. As he turned to leave, her hand caught his. "Stay," she whispered. "Just hold me tonight." They slept curled together like quotation marks, his hand protectively over their babies, her head tucked under his chin. For the first time in months, both slept peacefully through the night. Morning found them still entwined, sunlight streaming through the window to paint patterns on the quilt. Alexander woke first, watching Sophie sleep, memorizing every detail of this moment he had thought lost forever. A knock at the door startled them both. Eleanor entered with a knowing smile and 2 cups of herbal tea. "The storm's passed," she observed mildly. but I'd say it's cleared the air quite nicely." Sophie blushed, but didn't move from Alexander's embrace. "Gran." "Oh, don't mind me," Eleanor chuckled. "I'm just happy to see my granddaughter smiling again. And these little ones need both their parents, especially now." As if in agreement, both twins chose that moment to wake, their movements strong enough to be visible through Sophie's nightgown. Alexander's hand automatically moved to soothe them, and the babies settled under their father's touch. "They know," Sophie said softly. "They've always known you'd come back to us." Alexander kissed her temple, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "I'm never leaving again. Whatever happens, whatever challenges come, we face them together." The morning sun painted Pine Valley in shades of new beginnings, the storm-washed air crisp with possibility. In Eleanor's cottage, surrounded by love both old and new, a family continued their journey of healing, guided by the steady rhythm of tiny heartbeats and the promise of tomorrow. Chapter 11. Love's Greatest Gift. The first signs came during an unusually warm spring afternoon. Sophie was in the nursery organizing tiny clothes while Alexander assembled the second crib. Eleanor's cottage had filled with baby preparations, two of everything, arranged with loving care in the room that had once been Sophie's childhood sanctuary. "Hand me that screwdriver," Alexander asked, frowning at the instruction manual. The corporate titan who once commanded boardrooms had met his match in Swedish furniture assembly. Sophie's laugh turned into a sharp intake of breath, her hand flying to her lower back. Alexander was on his feet instantly, the forgotten screwdriver clattering to the floor. "Sophie?" "I'm fine," she assured him, but her face had paled slightly. "Just Braxton Hicks again." But something felt different this time. The contractions continued through dinner, growing more regular. Eleanor watched her granddaughter carefully, noting how Sophie paused more frequently, her hand instinctively cradling her belly. "Perhaps," the grandmother suggested gently, "we should call Dr. Anderson." Before Sophie could protest, another contraction hit, stronger this time, making her grip the kitchen counter. Alexander's arm was around her instantly, supporting her weight. "That's it," he decided. "We're going to the hospital." The drive to Pine Valley Regional Medical Center was tense with anticipation. Alexander navigated the mountain roads with unusual care, every bump making him wince in sympathy as Sophie breathed through increasingly powerful contractions. "Talk to me," she gasped during a particularly strong one. "Distract me." "Remember our first dance?" he began, one hand leaving the wheel to grasp hers. "At Canlis, when you challenged me to trust you enough to dance in public?" Sophie managed a smile between contractions. "You were so stiff at first, so worried about your reputation. And then you laughed, and suddenly nothing else mattered except making you laugh again." He squeezed her hand. "That's when I started falling in love with you, though I didn't know it yet." The hospital emerged from the darkness, its lights a beacon of hope and anxiety. Dr. Anderson was waiting for them, alerted by Eleanor's call. "Let's check on these babies," she said cheerfully, helping Sophie into a wheelchair. "Looks like they're eager to meet their parents." The examination confirmed what Sophie had instinctively known. This was no false alarm. She was already 6 centimeters dilated, her body preparing to bring their children into the world. "Both babies are in good position," Dr. Anderson assured them, "but with twins, we need to monitor everything carefully." The next few hours passed in a blur of increasing intensity. Alexander never left Sophie's side, supporting her through each contraction, wiping her forehead, murmuring encouragement. "You're amazing," he whispered as she gripped his hand through another wave of pain. "So strong, so beautiful." "I'm scared," she admitted during a brief respite. "What if something goes wrong?" Alexander kissed her damp forehead. "Nothing will go wrong. You and these babies are fighters. Just look how far we've all come already. Eleanor arrived with Sophie's hospital bag and stayed to provide additional support. She watched with pride as Alexander tended to her granddaughter, seeing in his every gesture the depth of his love and commitment. As dawn approached, the contractions intensified. Sophie's world narrowed to the rhythm of her body's demands, each wave bringing their children closer to arrival. 9 centimeters, Dr. Anderson announced after checking her progress. Almost time to meet your babies. Alexander felt his heart race with equal parts excitement and terror. Soon he would be a father, a role he'd once thought forever lost through his own mistakes. Remember what we practiced, he encouraged Sophie, helping her find a more comfortable position. Breathe with me, just like that. The moment of truth arrived with the morning sun. Sophie's cry of effort mingled with the first piercing wail of new life as their daughter entered the world. She's perfect, Dr. Anderson announced, placing the tiny bundle briefly on Sophie's chest before whisking her away for quick checks. Now let's get her brother to join us. Minutes that felt like hours passed before a second cry joined the first. Their son arrived with his sister's same determination, announcing his presence to the world with healthy lungs. Alexander found himself crying unashamedly as the nurses cleaned and checked both babies. Sophie lay exhausted but radiant, her eyes never leaving their children. "Would you like to hold your daughter?" a nurse asked Alexander, approaching with a pink bundle. His hands trembled as he accepted her, marveling at how something so tiny could feel so significant. "Hello, little one," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your daddy." The baby's eyes opened at the sound of his voice, seeming to focus on his face with an intensity that stole his breath. She had Sophie's nose and his dark hair, a perfect blend of them both. Their son, when placed in Sophie's arms, proved to have his father's eyes and his mother's determined expression. Both babies were healthy, strong, and absolutely perfect. "They need names," Sophie said softly, watching Alexander cradle their daughter. They had discussed options, but waited for this moment to make final decisions. "Lily Eleanor," Alexander suggested, looking at their daughter, "for your grandmother, who never lost faith in love's power to heal." Sophie's eyes filled with tears as she glanced at Eleanor, who was trying unsuccessfully to hide her own emotion. "It's perfect, and for our son." "Matthew Alexander," Eleanor suggested. "Matthew means gift from God, and he truly is a gift, one that brought his parents back together." The babies seemed to approve, both making soft cooing sounds that melted their parents' hearts. Alexander carefully sat on the edge of Sophie's bed, arranging himself so both babies were cradled between them. "Thank you," he whispered to Sophie, his voice rough with emotion, "for giving me a second chance, for these miraculous children, for believing love could be stronger than fear." Sophie's free hand found his. "Thank you for finding your way back to us, for proving that trust can be rebuilt, that love can heal what pride and fear broke apart." Eleanor watched from the doorway as her granddaughter and the man who had found his way back to love gazed at their newborn children. The morning sun streamed through the window, painting the scene in shades of gold and promise. The babies dozed peacefully, unaware of the journey that had brought them to this moment, the pain, the separation, the healing that their very existence had inspired. They knew only the warmth of their parents' love, the security of being held in arms that had learned the hard way never to let go again. A nurse entered to check vital signs, smiling at the picture-perfect family scene. "Have you decided on middle names?" "Hope," Sophie said softly, looking at Lily. "Because she helped us find our way back to each other. And trust," Alexander added, touching Matthew's tiny hand, "because that's what we're building again, day by day." Lily Eleanor Hope Sterling and Matthew Alexander Trust Sterling, their names were more than just labels. They were declarations of faith in love's ability to overcome any obstacle, to heal any wound, to build bridges across the widest chasms. As morning fully dawned over Pine Valley, the little family remained in their bubble of joy and wonder. Alexander couldn't stop staring at his children, memorizing every perfect feature, every tiny movement. "I never thought I could love like this," he admitted quietly. "It's terrifying and wonderful all at once." "That's parenthood," Eleanor chuckled from her chair. "And you're just getting started." Sophie watched Alexander with their daughters, saw how naturally he took to fatherhood despite his fears. The man who had once measured success in profit margins now counted it in tiny fingernails and perfect eyelashes. "We should let you rest, Doctor," Anderson said, entering to check on her patients. "Dad and Grandma can take the babies to the nursery for a bit," but Sophie wasn't ready to let them go just yet. "Stay," she said to Alexander. "Just a little longer." He needed no convincing, settling more comfortably on the bed with Matthew, while Sophie held Lily. Eleanor tactfully excused herself to call family and friends with the happy news. In the quiet hospital room, surrounded by the miracle of new life and renewed love, Sophie and Alexander began the next chapter of their story. The twins slept peacefully, their tiny hands occasionally reaching out as if to confirm their parents' presence. "I love you," Alexander whispered, the words carrying the weight of their entire journey. The pain, the separation, the healing, and now the joy of new beginnings. Sophie's response was simple but profound. "We love you too. All of us, forever." Outside, Pine Valley awakened to a spring morning made more beautiful by the arrival of its newest residents. The mountains stood sentinel as always, their peaks touched with the last of winter's snow, their slopes promising the warmth of coming summer. In the hospital room, 4 hearts beat in newfound harmony, while love, tested by fire, strengthened by faith, proven by time, wrapped them all in its unbreakable embrace. Chapter 12. Love's Perfect Circle. 1 year later. The garden of Eleanor's cottage bloomed with roses and laughter. Lily and Matthew's first birthday celebration had transformed the space into a wonderland of soft colours and twinkling lights. Paper lanterns swayed in the mountain breeze, casting dancing shadows across faces both familiar and new. Alexander stood at the grill, expertly flipping burgers, while keeping one eye on Matthew, who had recently mastered the art of walking and was using his new skill to explore every corner of the garden. The corporate titan had evolved into something entirely different, a father who knew the words to every lullaby, who could change diapers with military precision, who measured success in giggles and first steps. "Careful, champion," he called as Matthew wobbled toward a flower bed. Sophie appeared as if by magic, scooping up their son before he could redesign Eleanor's prized petunias. "Just like his father," she laughed, kissing Matthew's dark curls. "Always pushing boundaries." Lily, settled contentedly in Eleanor's lap, clapped her hands at the sight of her brother's rescue. At 12 months, the twins had developed distinct personalities that delighted and challenged their parents in equal measure. The guest list for their birthday celebration reflected the beautiful merger of their two worlds. Marcus and Raylin had flown in from Seattle, where they continued to manage Sterling Provisions' day-to-day operations. Michael and other friends from Pine Valley mingled with corporate executives, the barriers between city and mountain life dissolving in the face of shared joy. "I still can't believe you're really staying," Marcus commented, accepting a perfectly grilled burger. The great Alexander Sterling, choosing small-town life over the corporate world. Alexander watched as Sophie danced with Matthew in her arms, their son's laughter carrying across the garden. "Best decision I ever made," he said simply, "though not the only one." Indeed, the past year had brought many changes. Sterling Provisions had evolved under Alexander's reformed vision, with the Children's Foundation expanding nationwide. But the company's headquarters had surprised everyone by relocating to Pine Valley, bringing jobs and opportunity while preserving the town's essential character. The old Morrison Foods building downtown had been transformed into a community center, offering education and support to local families. Victoria's confession and subsequent legal troubles had led to Morrison's downfall, but from those ashes something meaningful had grown. "Da-da!" Lily's voice carried across the garden as she took wobbling steps toward Alexander. He handed the grilling tongs to Marcus and knelt to catch his daughter, her tiny arms wrapping around his neck in complete trust. The sight still had the power to bring tears to his eyes, this unconditional love, this perfect faith. Lily had Sophie's spirit and his determination, while Matthew had inherited his mother's gentle heart and his father's questioning mind. As evening approached, Eleanor brought out the birthday cakes, 2 small masterpieces she had baked herself. One was decorated with mountains and trees for Matthew, the other with roses and butterflies for Lily. The twins sat in their high chairs, eyes wide at the sight of their first birthday candles. "Make a wish," Sophie whispered, standing between them with her hands on their chairs. Alexander's arm slipped around her waist as they watched their children experience this milestone. The gathered friends and family sang "Happy Birthday," their voices carrying up into the mountain air. Lily and Matthew, with considerable help from their parents, blew out their candles to enthusiastic applause. As twilight painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, the party began to wind down. Eleanor shooed away help with the cleanup, insisting that the young family take a moment for themselves. They walked together through the cooling evening, Matthew asleep in Alexander's arms, while Sophie carried a drowsy Lily. The path led them to their new home, a beautiful mountain house just down the road from Eleanor's cottage, built to Alexander's exacting standards, but filled with Sophie's warmth. The twins' room was a wonderland of stars and soft colors, the hand-painted forest scene from their original nursery, recreated on a grander scale. Alexander and Sophie tucked their children into their cribs, standing together to watch them drift into peaceful sleep. "Happy," Alexander whispered, pulling Sophie close. "More than I ever dreamed possible," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "Do you ever miss it? The excitement of corporate life, the power, the challenge?" Alexander turned her to face him, his eyes serious in the soft nightlight glow. "What I have now, this life, these children, your love, it's worth more than every deal I ever made. The real challenge, the real excitement is watching our babies grow, helping them become who they're meant to be." They moved to their favorite spot, the window seat in their bedroom, overlooking the valley below. The moon painted the mountains in silver light, the same mountains that had witnessed their pain, their healing, their redemption. "I have something for you," Alexander said softly, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring, not her original wedding ring, but something new and meaningful. "Alexander, this past year has taught me what real love means," he said, taking her hand. "Not the careful, controlled version I thought I wanted, but the kind that's messy and magical and absolutely worth fighting for. This ring is a new promise, not just to love you, but to trust in that love every single day." The ring was beautiful, a delicate band of rose gold set with small diamonds and 2 tiny birthstones, one for each of their children. As Alexander slipped it onto her finger beside her wedding band, Sophie felt tears spring to her eyes. "When I found out I was pregnant," she said quietly, "I had this dream of how our life could be. But this, what we have now, it's better than any dream. Because it's real, because we fought for it, because we learned what matters most." From the twins' room came the soft sound of Matthew's midnight babbling, his usual signal that he was briefly awake and checking on his sister. They smiled at the familiar noise, at this small evidence of the bond their children shared. "Should we tell them our news?" Alexander asked, his hand drifting to Sophie's stomach. She covered his hand with hers, smiling. "Soon. Let them have their special day. There'll be time enough to tell everyone about their new little sister." The mountain night wrapped around them like a blanket, full of promise and possibility. In the valley below, Pine Valley's lights twinkled like earthbound stars, while real stars blazed overhead in the clear mountain sky. Their journey had been one of love lost and found, of trust broken and rebuilt, of fear overcome by faith. But here, in this moment, with their children sleeping nearby and new life growing beneath their joined hands, they had found something profound, not just love, but the wisdom to protect it, nurture it, let it grow wild and beautiful like Eleanor's roses. "Dance with me," Alexander asked softly, pulling Sophie to her feet. "There's no music," she protested with a laugh. "There's always music," he replied, beginning to hum their wedding song as they swayed together in the moonlight. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, board meetings conducted via video call while bouncing babies on knees, story times that doubled as strategy sessions, the constant beautiful chaos of family life. But tonight was for this moment, this dance, this love that had proven stronger than pride or fear or doubt. In their cribs, Lily and Matthew slept peacefully, their dreams painted in colours of joy and security. In the garden below, Eleanor's roses released their nighttime fragrance to the mountain air, and in their room, bathed in moonlight and possibility, Sophie and Alexander continued their dance, no longer two broken souls seeking healing, but one family, one heart, one love made perfect by the very trials that had threatened to destroy it. The mountain night cradled them all in its ancient peace, while love, tested by fire, proven by time, strengthened by faith, wrapped them in its eternal embrace. Their story, like all great love stories, had known darkness and light, sorrow and joy. But here, in this moment, they had found their happy ending, or rather, their beautiful beginning. For love, real love, never truly ends. It grows, changes, faces challenges, and emerges stronger. Like the mountains surrounding Pine Valley, it stands sentinel through all seasons, its foundation unshakable, its peak touching heaven, while its roots run deep in Earth's ancient heart. As midnight approached, Sophie and Alexander stood at their window, his arms around her waist, her head resting against his chest. Below them, Pine Valley slept in moonlit peace. Above them, stars wheeled in their eternal dance, and between them, love beat steady and strong, a rhythm as old as time and as new as tomorrow's dawn. "I love you," Alexander whispered into Sophie's hair, the words carrying the weight of their entire journey. "I love you too," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. "Yesterday, today, always." The mountain night embraced their promise, while in their cribs their children slept safe in the knowledge that love, true love, can overcome any obstacle, heal any wound, and light the way home through the darkest night. Subscribe if you liked.